My name is Ashley Studholm. I'm with the Prince William Conservation Alliance, one of the sponsors of this fabulous event that you all are enjoying today. And welcome back for breakout session 2. And it is my pleasure to introduce this next speaker. I had the pleasure of actually going to the food forest that she created, and it's really just a terrific model and vision for what we can create in every yard and in every green space, honestly. And it's a really great reminder that our native forests are food forests. And so I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about the process that Sarah went through in developing this project. And hopefully that'll inspire all of you to do something similar with whatever space you have. So Sarah is the lead forest maker of the Foragers Forest, a master's student in the environmental science and policy at George Mason University, and a member of the Arlington Regional Master Naturalists. She is an avid backpacker, and her experience in the backcountry sparked her interest in restoring urban landscapes. Before transitioning to the field of ecological restoration, Sarah worked for industry trade associations and an environmental law think tank, and we are delighted to have her with us. Please help me welcome Sarah Roth.
Thank you, Ashley. Let's test whether this is working. Can you hear me okay there? Is that good? Okay, good. Thank you so much, Ashley. So, we all good?
Yep.
Okay, great. So today I'll be talking about this project that Ashley so wonderfully introduced for me, the project of growing a native food forest. So for our agenda today, I wanted to share a little bit about my background so that you understand kind of the perspective that I'm coming from and the life history that I bring to this project. Give a little bit of a project overview so that you know kind of what we're dealing with, and then go into a more step-by-step detailed process of how we develop the Foragers Forest. And then we'll go into questions after that. So, thank you. Okay, there we go. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Honduras and Texas. I ended up spending the first half of my childhood in Honduras. And this is, as most of you know, a tropical country in Central America. And I spent a ton of time playing outside. I had a lot of wildlife interactions. And as you can see here in this photo on the far left, that was me meeting my grandmother's parrots. So she had many different parrots in her house. She actually lived at the base of this mountain in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, where she had toucans nesting outside of her window. So she lived in a really amazing space, and her yard was basically jungle. So I got to explore the space quite often when I was there. And you can see here, later on, I ended up having my own parakeets, and I kind of raised them and kept them and spent a lot of time with these different animals. I had 8 dogs too, and tons of cats and other domestic and wild species that I spent a lot of time with. And when I entered my adolescence, I moved with my family to the suburbs of Dallas. So this is a very, concrete jungle kind of space. I didn't have a lot of that kind of nature interaction and wildlife interaction. So I had this kind of dry spell in my life. And it wasn't until my 20s that I rediscovered the outdoors through backpacking. So these are just some photos from the different backpacking trips that I've been on. I've been trying to do one annually every year, but I sometimes get out and do a couple. And so on the far left, that's from the Grand Canyon. And I also was in the Adirondacks just last year. So really excited to be in an amazing lush forest. And then on the bottom here, this is from Dolly Sods. Actually got caught in a rainstorm and had to cross this kind of rushing stream or river. So it was pretty wild. And at the time when I was, doing all of this I guess just last year, I was living in Roslyn, so in Arlington. And Roslyn, as many of you will know, has a really high percentage of impervious surface. So I actually looked it up. It's about 80% impervious surface in Roslyn, in the area where I was living. And so I would come back from these trips and feel really recharged, feel really great, and then immediately crave going into a space like this again. And so, that kind of got me thinking about what my role might be in trying to bring more high quality natural spaces into urban and suburban environments. So that led me to the Master Naturalist program. I found out about that when I was taking a tree ID class. After that, that same year, I enrolled in my master's program in environmental science and policy at George Mason, and started this project as well. I spent a year at Ursanga as a, basically as an intern working with them on their ecological restoration, kind of propagating all these these native plants. And then just a few weeks ago, I joined Fairfax County's Stormwater Planning Division as a landscape architect. So it's been a really exciting couple of years. And really busy, but a really exciting career transition for me. So this project has been a really important part of that, the Foragers Forest, which I'll describe here in a little bit. So just by way of an overview of the project, this is a project that I worked closely with my graduate advisor, Dr. Dan Scleroux at George Mason University, as well as Donnie Nolan, who's here in the front today. And there was an opportunity to apply for a grant on behalf of George Mason University for a ChangeX platform and for funds from Amazon Web Services. So we ended up putting a proposal out there, and we really merged several different concepts. The main ones being thinking about food security on campus and tying in ecological health as well. How could we grow a supplemental source of food for our campus that was also grown in a way that is supporting those ecological connections in our environment and on our campus environment specifically? And so we ended up winning the grant. And we applied for two more, both from George Mason University. So one of them from the Institute for Sustainable Earth, and the other one from the Patriot Green Fund. So in total, last year, we received $40,000 for this project, which was super exciting. And that same calendar year, we designed and installed this project, which you'll find, as we go through this process. It was quite a bit of work. And a lot of learning for us as well. So what makes this project unique is that it's the first food forest with 100% native plants that we know of in the region. It's kind of hard to validate these things because you're looking at what's on the internet and what people are talking about. But from what we can tell, this is a pretty unique concept. And so that was kind of the origins of this project. So as we start to zoom in on the project, you can see that we're on George Mason University Fairfax campus, and the two gold stars are the two groves of the Foragers Forest. So these are two distinct kind of habitat types, or food production kind of groves, and we're in a really centrally located part of the campus. So, if you look at it, if you use your imagination, it kind of looks like a tennis shoe kicked up, like with the tip up and the heel down at the bottom. And so that whole parcel of land is around 10 acres. And so it used to be the site of student apartments on campus. Those were demolished in 2018. And now there are different clusters of oaks and pines kind of towards the left side, where you see Student Union Building kind of in that direction a little bit on that parcel. It's covered in turf grass in that area. And then on the far left, you can see that there are some trees here, right? It looks kind of forested as you go up in there. And that's a riparian corridor, a small stream that cuts through Mason campus. And that went through a restoration process that wrapped up last year. And so that is a kind of little remnant forest patch. And you can see here, this is the restoration that happened. So you can see that, there was quite a bit of work done on rerouting, kind of fixing the stream routing there. There are live stakes planted on the sides of that stream. And there's a really nice remnant forest in there, right? And so we have a bunch of white oaks and some red oaks in there as well. We have an understory of hazelnuts and elderberry and a bunch of other really amazing native things. And there is a wetland. If you keep going like a couple hundred feet, there's a wetland with skunk cabbage at the end of this. So it's a really nice little space. And so when it came to selecting a site for the Foragers Forest, we had a few different options. And we were really excited about this one because we had an opportunity to convert turf grass to a more native cover and kind of expand the footprint of this really amazing, kind of valuable space here. So this is what the Foragers Forest looks like as of probably 2 months ago. And it still looks like this right now because we're in winter, everything is still dormant. But it's divided into 2 distinct groves. These are our forest grove and a thicket grove. So our forest grove is planted in a style that's like the Miyawaki method. I'll go into that a little bit further down the presentation. So basically that means it's a very dense planting. So this is a lot of our canopy, subcanopy, and understory species in here. And those clusters of trees and shrubs are also surrounded by native meadow. So we wanted to have a nice kind of transition and in that ecotone, right? Not just go from trees to turf grass, but think about how can we transition that in a little bit of a smoother path with some meadow plants around that. And then for our thicket grove, that's our more sun-loving section. So you'll see that the trees in there, not our canopy trees, right? There are more kind of shorter varieties. Some of them are even the suckering varieties that tend to form these natural thickets. And this is the space where we have a lot of our species that grow more fruits and nuts under full sun conditions. And getting at what makes this really unique is the fact that every plant planted as part of this project is native to Fairfax County. So not just native to the state, but to the county itself. And in total, we have around 54 plant species planted in this space. And those are across our forest, thicket, and meadow kind of habitats. And some of the species here, this is not the actual plants, but these are photos of the species that we have planted in that space. These are all represented in there. So we have things like our native plums and sumac, black walnuts, native roses, hazelnuts, elderberry, black raspberry, and then we're going to have beautiful kind of flowering plants as well, like our New England aster, golden alexanders. And you may recognize a tree in here that's functionally extinct in this part of the country, our American chestnuts. So we are working right now with the American Chestnut Foundation to get hybrid chestnut seeds to plant into our site as well, our forest grove. So it's a really exciting aspect of our project. So this project can be a little challenging to talk about because it merges so many different concepts and themes. So I wanted to include a slide here that really shows all of the different themes that we're working with as part of the project. So the big ones, as I mentioned in the beginning, are really the ecological rehabilitation piece, making those connections, ecological connections, improving the soil, creating food resources, not just for people, but for wildlife. But also that food security bit too, having a supplemental source of fresh, nutritious foods on campus that are free and available to anybody, our community, our campus community. But also, thinking about the wildlife aspects of this. So, we talk about food deserts when we talk about different neighborhoods, right, and different parts of like human life. But a lot of our urban and suburban environments are food deserts for wildlife too. A lot of research has shown that a lot of our garden plants and our ornamentals are non-native, and they don't offer as good of food resources and cover that are needed for a lot of our wildlife. And so that was one of our core goals as well. And the Miyawaki method, we'll go into that, thinking about increasing that biodiversity, and the native plants help us to do that. And you can see here ecotones, forest, meadow, so having a diversity of different habitats and spaces, not just for our wildlife, but also to grow different things too, right? All of our different plants kind of grow in different conditions. And then finally thinking about the social aspects of it. So education, we're on a college campus. Our facilities department has a mandate to work to expand kind of educational environments, right? And to work with faculty and our researchers, because that's kind of the point of a university environment. Making opportunities for people to connect with nature as well. And I think foraging is a really lovely way to do that. There's a lot of plant blindness out there, and I'll say it too because I experienced this just a few years ago, right before I did a deep dive into the space. I couldn't have told you what was out in my yard or whether it was native or non-native. And I think foraging is a really excellent way to get people interested in learning about the different plants that are in their yard, why they're important, why they're interesting too, right? That you can taste them, you can smell them, you can enjoy their beauty. So there's all of these different aspects to it. So with any project like this, it's important to define what success will look like at the end. And for us, we wanted the Foragers Forest at the end of this kind of horizon and at different milestones along the way to eventually become a healthy semi-natural system. So because we're in an urban environment or suburban environment, this space will never be, I don't think we'll be to a point where we can't have human intervention, right? We're always going to have a little bit of intervention in terms of keeping some of the invasives out and maintaining that space a bit, in terms of like a community stewardship role. And recognizing that we want to minimize that maintenance over time though. We also want to grow food and attract foragers. That's a really important piece. But also use it as an educational space to talk about how to ethically and respectfully use a space, and how to forage for native plants in a way that doesn't decimate, the native plant population, and that allows food resources to be there for others and for wildlife. So kind of thinking about the different ethical dimensions of foraging. And then using this site, as a demonstration site, a living lab, a place for people to see kind of what native plants can look like in a space like this. So now we'll go into kind of the details of the project. So first I'll talk about site selection. What were the different evaluation criteria that were involved in us selecting that site? The site conditions, what we had to learn about the site in order to develop our plant list, our design, and the kind of site prep that needed to happen for us to install the plants. And finally, we'll talk about maintenance. So as I mentioned kind of at the outset, Mason was in support of us, seeking the grant that we did. And as part of that, they agreed that if we won the grant, that they would give us a piece of land to work on to develop this project. And so when we won the site, when we won the grant, we basically had several sites accessible to us. And in order to compare and contrast the different sites and to figure out which site would be the best for us, we developed this evaluation criteria. So one of the main evaluation bits was thinking about size. In our grant proposal, we had talked about doing, potentially an eighth to, half an acre. So we had a certain size constraints. We also wanted to do tree clusters and have a perimeter meadow. So that requires a little bit of space, right, to do that. We also wanted the space to be somewhere where students and our community would find it. So there were a couple of nice sites that were on campus that were a little tucked away, and they're not the kind of sites that people were walking by very often. And so that came into our consideration as well. Existing vegetation, some of the sites already had some native cover, and actually some of them were kind of in forested areas already. And so we knew, okay, if we're planting in an existed kind of forested area that's already pretty good quality, what kind of uplift are we having? Because we wanted, for us, it would be a little more advantageous to take a site that was in worse condition and to bring it to a point where it had that good native cover than to come into a site that already had some good native cover. And then thinking about infrastructure too. So a lot of these places where we're going to be doing these kind of projects already have infrastructure either underground, right? Thinking about like sewer lines or, maybe different utilities, as well as power lines overhead. If we have power lines overhead, we don't want to be planting canopy trees. And if that's something that you have in mind for a project like this, then you kind of have to think about how that site will affect that. So these were some of the considerations that we were thinking about as we kind of compared the different sites. And once we settled on our site and selected that site, we really had to do the work to understand what the site conditions were like. So one of the first things we looked at was the soil and hydrology at that site. So we did a soil test through the Virginia Tech Soil Testing Lab. And these are pretty easy. These are pretty cool. I mean, we live in a really great area of the country where, these testing kits are at our libraries. They're super accessible. It took just a few minutes to get that soil test, that sample put together, sent to Virginia Tech. And we got those results back within, I don't know, a week, 10 days. So that's a really great resource at your disposal. We also worked with the Soil and Water Conservation District with Dan Schwartz, who I know is here today too, presenting. Yeah, he came out. I reached out to him, and I knew him from the Master Naturalist, program as a whole. And I reached out and I said, hey, we have the site. We're trying to understand the soil. Would you mind coming out? And he did. And actually, this is a photo from us kind of doing the soil cores and trying to figure out, what were the components of that soil. Where was the water table based on what we were seeing. And this is all the kind of the information that we gathered from that afternoon. And based on where the water table was, based on the fact that there's some compaction, it's not a very well draining site. He really suggested that we focus on facultative plants or facultative wet plants. So plants that could withstand occasionally wet feet, right? And that was really helpful. So you can see how we're kind of building this timeline, these sets of this action and this understanding over time. And so now this will lead us into kind of what kind of plants that we want to focus on for our site. So we also wanted to know what kind of cover was already on the site, what kind of plant communities are there. So we did a rough kind of vegetation inventory, just looking at what were the different tree and shrub species that are in that kind of riparian corridor. We use Virginia's Natural Heritage Program data. So they actually have really great resources on our natural communities, our natural forest types. And based on some of the common species that were in that corridor, things like white oak and tulip tree, red maple, and black gum, we weren't sure because this area has had a lot of work done to it, including that stream restoration. They took out some trees as part of that, and this is not a pristine site. But generally, we thought this might be kind of a mesic mixed hardwood forest. And so as part of the ecological connections that we wanted to rebuild in that site, we looked at what are some species that are constituents of that forest type that we could bring into our planting and have those, as a seed source, right? I mean, even thinking about what species would be in that forest type that might not be on site that we might want to bring in as a seed source and include in our planting as well, kind of as companion plants. Not everything had to be edible in our space. So, and as we developed our planting list, these were some of the considerations and criteria that we were thinking about. Planting for the site conditions, we talked about that a little bit before, focusing on some of our facultative and facultative wet species, hedging against drought. Last year, I mentioned that I spent the year at Ursanga, the native plant nursery, and I kind of witnessed firsthand how, that drought that we had in the spring affected us in our work, right? So we did some plantings, and when you're not getting the kind of water that you need, the rainfall that you need, it can really be harmful for trying to establish these plants. So I thought, at least we could intermix some different drought tolerant species, especially in our meadow, since that's where we had a little bit of flexibility. We also wanted to incorporate the ecotones. This was one of the things that we had thought about, like in the very beginning. It was a part of our kind of initial conceptual design. And so what kind of plants would we include as part of those ecotones, right? What kind of forest species and thicket species and meadow species would we want to incorporate into our plant list that meet these other criteria as well? And then thinking about, as I said, the plant species in that remnant forest and what we might want to plant in there to augment that ecosystem. And of course, this is a food forest, so we want to, plant and have a focal point, our edible species and our medicinal species, as well as those species that are also have ornamental value. So this is not, just a space where you would want to, maybe pick something off the plant and eat it, but also can we highlight some of our really special native plants, like our native roses, and some of our wildflowers that have that ornamental value that could be a great stand-in for another plant that's non-native, right? In our gardens and in our yards. Thinking about value for wildlife as well. So I kind of thought about the space as being, food for people and food for wildlife, kind of thinking about those different angles. So planting in keystone species. Doug Tallamy talks a lot about, our keystone species like our oaks, our cherries, our willows. So we definitely incorporated some of those, and that helped with the weighting too, right? We only have so many plants we can put in here. Can we select some plants that have both that edible component for people, but also for high quality value for nature as well? Timeline to harvest, really important when you have a native food forest. Some of our oaks are not going to be producing anything for many, many, many years, right? So how do we incorporate plants that will be giving us some kind of edible component earlier on in that process? So can we have something in that first season, or something coming online within the first or second year, and then another thing coming online within that 3 to 5 year period, and so that we have new things kind of every year coming up. And of course, the aesthetics, which I had mentioned. So I wanted to highlight a few of the species that we put in the food forest, just to kind of give you an idea, a taste of what we have in that space. So we planted several white oaks. I had mentioned before, white oaks are some of the species that were present in that remnant forest patch. There's actually a bunch on that kind of campus parcel. And this is one of our most common and widespread oak species in Virginia. And white oaks, of course, everyone probably knows here, that's a huge wildlife value. And they have a long history as an indigenous food staple. So, acorns can be ground into like a meal or a flour, baked into breads, put into stews and soups. And then, they're a key sustenance source for a lot of our wildlife, whether it's birds or mammals and insects as well. But what was really interesting, I think, about this is that we're able to kind of highlight that in our space, while also leveraging the fact that we have mature oaks in that remnant space as well. So we don't have to wait for these guys to be producing acorns, which will be a little bit, will be a while before we can start trying with our campus community some of the acorns in that larger space. So that was a really cool kind of component of it as well. Our swamp rose. So people probably don't think of like a food source when you think about like a rose, native rose, but I'm sorry. Oh, but our rose hips and petals and roots can be used in a tea. The hips can be added to different things like soups and stews. And then they have a really great, wildlife value. They're excellent cover for wildlife, and the hips are eaten by a variety of birds as well. As we're kind of highlighting these different species, you can tell these are, a canopy tree. Now we're at a shrub. And the next one is really our tiniest kind of perennial plant, right? This is up to a height of 6 inches. So our wild strawberry. I wanted to highlight a few different species at those different layers. And this is, something that produces a nice, delicious fruit. We all recognize the commercial fruit, strawberries that we get in the grocery store are really a hybrid between this and another South American species. So these have a lot of really great value to eat out of hand. And there's great wildlife value here too. There's even a specialized rose miner bee that depends on this plant as well. So to give you a sense for the different species and the plant types in this planting, you can see that around half of the species that are represented in this space are trees and shrubs. And the other half are really broken up between herbaceous perennials. I think there's a couple of annuals in there too, and then grasses. So there's a good mix of different kind of plant types in there. And then we have over 50% of the species have some kind of edible or medicinal value as well. Not all of them are the same. We have acorns, things like acorns, blueberries, and then we might have like a mountain mint, which can be used in a tea. So that's a pretty varied kind of edible kind of ranking, but still useful. And I wanted to share some of the resources that we use in developing this plant list, because it was really an amalgamation of all of this different kind of information that was at our disposal. So the Flora Virginia app, if you haven't used it, I think it's pretty useful. I actually used it a lot when I was working at the native plant nursery, just to identify some of the things that were in our nursery as I was working and trying to understand, what the different native plants look like. Ethnobotanical books, there's a few really good ones out there that help you kind of understand some of the native plants that are edible and kind of what parts of them are edible, how you harvested, all that different information. We also visited regional food forests. So we have some great food forests in our area. A few of them are in Maryland. And so went out and visited the Reed Center. They're thinking about those ecological connections as well. Forested is also another really excellent food forest in the region. And then generally, we relied on local native plant and restoration experts as advisors on our project. So, not just, there was a lot of back and forth and questions and, hey, would this be great in there? And kind of, would this species work in this kind of site conditions? And what's edible and, what can we make out of these different species? So there was a lot of consultation and a lot of expertise that we tapped in our local community. There's so many amazing people here who know a lot. So, and I called out a few here, but yeah, there's a lot of great resources. I think if you do a project like this, these are all resources that are at our disposal, I think, as our general community. So, in designing the space, we basically, because I talked about we have our thicket grove and we have our forest grove, there was really going to be two different types of designs here. As I mentioned, this is our sun-loving thicket. We wanted to really cap out the max height at around 35 feet. We didn't want too many trees growing up and kind of blocking and shading the sun for some of our things like blueberries and huckleberries and hazelnuts that grow really well under those full sun conditions. And I guess I should say produce more fruit under those conditions as well. So we had, I think our dogwoods were our largest species in this space. And we ended up clustering those towards the northern end. So actually the top of the drawing is kind of the northern side of the planting, and the bottom is the southern side. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, no worries. So yeah, so we actually used permaculture techniques too, and design techniques in terms of setting up the space. So, thinking about putting our tallest species towards that northern end of our planting, and like gradually decreasing in height as we go down to the southern end to really maximize that sun exposure across our grove. And so you can see here, each of the big circles on that drawing, those are our trees and shrubs. So we have a number of different things like smooth serviceberry, Canadian serviceberry in there. We have American plums, and we have, as I mentioned, our dogwoods. And then as you start to come south, in those big kind of circles, right, those clump plantings of our trees and shrubs, we have more of our hazelnuts and our blueberries and our huckleberries, and even, black raspberries and blackberries. So we wanted to make sure that we kept that kind of sun exposure as you came down. And everything was clustered in the space too to maximize that foraging access, right? So we didn't want to have things too dense and too clustered for people to be able to access the fruit. And each of these tree and shrub clusters, which are the larger circles, are in the sea of meadow, right? They're kind of surrounded by meadow plants. And the meadow plants are what you can see here are all the little tiny circles that you see on the drawing. So all in all, we worked with a landscape architect. Mason wanted us to work with one of their landscape architects who knew the site pretty well, kind of knew the conditions and the design criteria that Mason was expecting. And so we kind of fed them, okay, this is what we want to do, this is what we want it to look like. And then they, laid out the drawings. And so all in all, in both drawings, there's over 1,500 plants individually placed and selected there. So it's a really interesting, and we'll get to that in a little bit, what staging looked like too for that. So this is what it looks like in person. And again, this is kind of this was only like a month ago or a couple months ago that this photo was taken. So you can kind of see that dark path that cuts through the middle and kind of curves to the right. That's our walking path. So that will eventually be, we'll install some kind of more permanent walking path. But the areas where it's a little more fuzzy and kind of light brown, kind of in the centers, that's where our meadow plants are, and the kind of darker clusters in the middle of that are our tree clusters. And both groves are surrounded by this wood chip border, kind of to set it apart from the other plantings, give it a little space from the turf grass maintenance that's happening right outside of that. So that gives you a sense for what that looks like right now. And as we get into talking about our forest grove, we kind of have to take a little detour to talk about the Miyawaki method. So this is a method or an approach to restoring late successional forests that was developed by the late professor, botanist, and forest ecologist, Dr. Akira Miyawaki. And he worked in Japan. And he was really interested in how we would restore late successional forests once those forests have been degraded. Maybe they've been gone for a long time. In places like Japan, he was recognizing that a lot of the forest trees that people thought were native there were actually not indigenous to those areas. They had been imported so long ago that there was this sense that they belonged there and that they had been there all along and were indigenous to the site. So he did a lot of work to try to find where he could identify native plant species in Japan. And what he found was that most of the native plant species that, especially forest plants, could be found around temples, because those tended to be more kind of conserved, right? Because of different considerations there. So his focus in his approach to this Miyawaki method, this approach to reforestation, was on dense planting and focusing on your locally native species. So how do we identify, our reference forest and that might be representative of the site that we're on right now, right? What kind of native species would be on our site if there hadn't been that degradation? And then he talked about, mixing those species, right? If we have now our plant list, we know what grew indigenous to the site. Let's not just plant our oaks over here and our hickories right here and our cherries over here, but let's mix them up and really mimic that distribution that you would see in a natural forest. And of course, he thought about this early on as kind of reestablishing those keystone structures, our trees, and that the understory would follow. And what he observed in this whole process and in doing this work was that there were really nice microclimatic benefits of planting very densely. So when you plant these trees close together, you start to get that canopy closure in a shorter time frame, right? And as the canopy closes, you retain more of that soil moisture. You are shading that soil, so you're able to develop that soil microbiome a little faster. You protect some of the really sensitive species from the kind of harsh, radiation from the sun and the wind. you know, things like our oaks and hickories, right? They're our understory species. And so I think they prefer having a little bit of that shade. And so that's really what he observed in doing this work. And these photos, I actually took these. I went to Japan last year for a personal trip and was able to visit Miyawaki's plantings that he did experimentally at Yokohama University, at his own university that he was teaching at. So it was really exciting. I think what struck me the most was that you can see here all of the trees are like even age, so they're all around the same size. And that stands out. I didn't realize how much our eyes really calibrate to the different ages of the trees, right? We're really used to seeing different diameters and sizes. So it was quite fascinating. And these are just a couple of photos from local government plantings. And these are designs from Arlington County and Fairfax County, where they're incorporating and adapting some of these approaches. So when it came to designing our forest grove, we wanted to incorporate that Miyawaki method. So we planted very densely, 3-foot centers, but 3 or 3.5-foot centers between all of our trees and shrubs. And you can see here, basically on the right side of that walking path that cuts through the middle, we have a cluster kind of on the higher end, and then we have a cluster down below. And on the left side of that pathway, we have 4 clusters that are all really kind of right next to each other, so all touching each other. And of course, those are all surrounded by native meadow as well. And I was really lucky to get to see kind of how Fairfax County designed their kind of nucleation schemes. And they had a really innovative, I thought, really great design where it's not just kind of a mixed species planted into each cluster, but it's really, putting a canopy tree next to an understory tree and a shrub to make sure that you have that spacing kind of between the different types of trees. And this is what that space looks like right now. And you can see that the stream corridor and that remnant forest right behind us. So we really are kind of taking some of that turf grass territory and converting it to native cover, which is really exciting. And as we were designing the space, these were some of the things that we were thinking about. So for our meadow plants, can we incorporate some of these more traditional landscape design features, like thinking about drifting and massing, and bringing that in, like that intentionality and that legibility to the design as well. We also wanted to keep our groves inside the resource protection area. So this is an area basically 100 feet perpendicular to that stream. That is a zone where it's not supposed to be developed. It's kind of protected from development. And so for us, that was really important to build our plantings into that protected space. We know that there's possibility of having some development on that larger parcel at some point in the future, but this kind of protects us. That was really important. Also building in some educational elements. We're working right now with Mason on tying into their arboretum. And so our plant signs and our QR codes for some of our species are going to be tied in with that. We're also developing interpretive signage, which I'm super excited about because it allows us to talk about some of these concepts that I've presented here today that are really hard to get across unless you have a bit of text. And I know that the Arboretum, there's also some pieces too where you can bring in audio tours and different things. So I think that there's some really cool opportunities here. Thinking about accessibility as well, making these spaces accessible to our wide community. The social aspects and also the maintenance is really important. So I'll go through this a little quicker. Basically, for the site prep, the site was covered in turf grass, fescue turf grass, and interestingly enough, it was seeded just a few weeks before we were to plant our site, and so that kind of threw a wrench in things. And yes, it was a little bit of a challenge, but ultimately what we ended up doing was removing the sod. And so, several of the decisions that we made as part of this project were more expensive, and there are cheaper ways to do those things. And really what it came down to was time. So our AWS grant, we had to spend 70% of it within 6 months. And a lot of that 6 months was us learning and, understanding our site, right? And trying to develop that plant list and everything. So towards the end, we were like, wow, we got to spend this money quick. And we had some deadlines, and so it kind of changed some of the approaches that we took for prepping the site and installation. We also added some leaf mulch to boost the soil organic matter in that space. We applied wood chips before the planting, so we wanted to delineate, which areas were going to be the areas where we were planting our woodies. We actually planned to do decompaction, and we weren't able to do that. So this comes back to the fact that we're in that RPA. There's potentially permits that you have to get in order to do that kind of soil disturbance in that site. And there were other kind of questions. So we ended up not doing decompaction. And installation, went pretty smoothly. Donnie was a huge, these are the pieces, the logistics and the installation. She really was our guru in that space. And she, manages a lot of volunteers and interns at Mason. And we staged those 1,500 plants. I don't know how long did it take? 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, something like that. We were out there for a really long time, but we got them all staged. So it was really exciting. And then our agreement with the university was that these plants would all be installed by contractors. So that's what we ended up doing. And the question here, did the design translate well to that physical space? It did for the most part. And this goes back to the photo on the right where I'm out there with a tape measure measuring like the distances between things. When I looked out at the site, like during the staging, I was like, man, those trees look too close together. Like I'm nervous about how close they are. And so that night before they were going to plant, I just went out there with a tape measure and measured everything, and then ended up having to pull out, 15 or 20 trees and shrubs that were, a little too dense. And so, this is kind of a reminder that our drawings are the best approximation, but you have to also double check the work in the field. And, in terms of maintenance, we're really, looking at, are we getting enough rainfall in the first 2 to 3 years? Is it like a historic drought, in which case we might need to go out and water those trees and shrubs in that first couple of years, just to make sure that they're going to survive that, right? Keeping out invasives, always a really important piece to this. Keeping that meadow maintained, that might be like annual or biannual mowing of that meadow. And then minimizing the use of chemical inputs. So this space is really meant to be managed in a more organic fashion because of the edible species in here. In terms of future work, we are trying to track these key measurements. So after all, we are a living lab. I might have neglected to mention that. So one of our grants is a living lab grant through the university. So the space is meant to be used as a living lab for our students to come out and kind of learn different concepts and see them in real life. Learn plant ID in this space. Our environmental science students can come out and do soil testing out there and other things that benefit us too, because we can track those different measurements over time and understand what the benefits are on our own sites of these different planting methods. Building community connections. So as a master naturalist, I'd love to tie in the master naturalist with this site as well. And then just maintaining the health of that adjacent forest. We're tied in with that. And so that needs to be a part of our long-term mission and work. And, just by way of key takeaways, including the right people on your team is huge. I don't think that we would have gotten this far. Actually, I'm pretty certain of it without the team that we had. So we had institutional support. We had, people really understood the organizational structure and how things happen within the university and within the different channels of decision making. We had faculty kind of enthusiasm and support, and all of that led to us getting all of the support, both financially and institutionally, that we needed. And we had the support from the community as well, right? We had so many experts that were willing and encouraging to help us. So that was really wonderful. Defining our values up front was really key. So, early on, we talked about, we don't want the site to have chemicals really used, unless there's some dire need, right? And then, as we were going through the process, even I was considering herbicide for the grass, because I was like, we're pinched for time. We have some, things we need to get done in this space. And other people on our team were like, no, we can't do that, right? We already talked about that. And that's one of our values, was maintaining this chemical free. And so, having those values defined up front is really key. Designing with maintenance in mind, I don't think I have to go into detail about that. And then just knowing that, things like grant deadlines, those are going to accelerate your timelines, and they're going to cause some stress, right? As you have to spend down money and you're not ready to yet. And then, the fact that there's seasonal natures to these things. We're working in a natural space that's open air and open to those kind of seasonal changes and weather patterns. And so that's the project.
That was great. Thank you so much, Sarah. We do have some time for questions, so we'll kind of bounce back and forth between the room, and I'm going to be monitoring the Zoom. But if you want to just call on people, and then I'll intersect with questions from online.
Sure. Why don't we start here? Yes, so that is interesting that you asked that. We have a kind of a handshake kind of understanding, but we're working on an official MOU right now. But we are working on Donnie's team being one of the kind of the lead on maintenance, and she works with she leads our gardens and greenhouse program. And she was a core part of the team. So I think that was why it was really important to bring her on too, because we knew as we were designing different things, she was like, no, don't put that there, because that's a really, annoying. It's annoying when the grasses kind of fall into the walkway, right? And she understands a lot of the kind of maintenance complexity of this. So I would say that there's a partnership here. So we're actually involving, the College of Science as well as so this is all we're working on this right now, but I think, we're working as a partnership, right? In terms of how the maintenance is structured. And I am going to be graduating soon. So I'm totally going to be a member of the community that's really involved in this, and potentially, if we tie in with the master naturalist, I could be a leader on the site, of course, because I know it pretty well. But yes, I think there's dimensions there that are important to work out for sure.
Hey, Sarah, when you get a question, could you repeat it so the folks online can hear you
Yes.
too?
Yes. I think did you still, yeah, because I think you raised your hand really early on. Yeah, so the question was, how did we get rid of the grass, and where were the wood chips used? So we had the sod actually removed, and that's very labor intensive. And this is where I was talking about the cost for the grass removal was definitely more expensive than it needed to be. There's other ways to do that, right? You can use mulch, or you can use, cardboard and mulch in other ways, solarizing. Yeah, it was like a sod cutter. And those were, trucked off site too. In terms of the mulch, the areas, so we had a wood chip border that kind of delineated the grove, and that's just for aesthetics to kind of, show that it's a formal site. And then we used pine bark wood chips for our planting areas for our woodies, our trees and shrubs. And this is really to suppress any kind of herbaceous plants that would be competing with our trees and shrubs in that kind of critical grow-in period, and just for ease of maintenance as well. Yeah. All right. Look. Okay, go ahead.
From online, do you have a plant list you could share?
Yes, I do. If actually the email that's on the projector right now, that's the best way to reach me. And I'd be happy to email them a copy of the list if they send me a message. Yeah. Okay. So I think you had your hand up. Mm-hmm.
Very easy to walk by and pick, but if you don't read some blackberries, raspberries, to read seeds.
Mm-hmm.
Now blackberries are a two-year plant, and one problem is that the stalks that are dead don't just go away.
Right.
It doesn't look pretty.
Mm-hmm.
But the other problem is with all those students coming
Mm-hmm.
Everybody remembers as a kid going picking blackberries, and it's not the taste that is important, it's the memory.
Yes, yeah.
But how do you keep, I mean, those blackberries and raspberries are gonna disappear immediately.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think that comes into the ethical and responsible foraging too, right? And that differs on a species by species basis. But yeah, well, I mean, we're gonna, we want to also have demonstrations, like cooking demonstrations. We're actually tying with the nutrition department as well. And so we want to have some demonstration kind of cooking and processing projects like on site, definitely as part of our curriculum and education. But yeah, you're right. There's a lot of individualized species specific kind of considerations at the foraging. And this is something we want to talk about through our tours. And, if we lead students out there on little foraging, foraging tours, talking about what's needed for the plants to sustain themselves as well. So a lot of the, nuts and a lot of what's in here is a lot of nuts and berries. And so typically, you can really, the consideration is wildlife, right? Competing with wildlife for those. But in this case, right.
The blackberries get picked, and so I point out to the people of this food for the animals, and we need some of those to drop to the ground to reseed.
Right. And so I think that comes into our signage materials as well. So we're going to be putting in potentially, yes. Maybe we need to keep an eye on those when we know they're ripening, right? Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to incorporate that in part of the conversation about the space, right? This is why I called out ethical foraging. What does it mean to, take a certain, take an amount that is sustainable for the plant and that plant community, that's also respectful of other people that are using that space. And, not just in that sense, but also in the sense that you are using the space. Are you putting time into, helping to conserve and preserve and like maintain the space as well? Because, there's a stewardship commitment in the space. And, if you're kind of coming in and taking from the space, what are you putting into it? I think that that's a really important conversation as well,
We have one more from online.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I understand.
But
Okay.
it's also a part of the point of the forest too, that we
Right.
do get to eat it. So it's just,
Right.
it's trying to balance that. From online, what was the edging that was used? Was it meta?
Meta, I'm not familiar. Or metal, maybe metal.
Maybe.
The edging, yeah, that was,
Oh,
I think
yeah,
it is
probably.
metal edging. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah. Okay. You had a question here? Yeah, so there were a couple different sizes. I was really balancing too. I really love local ecotype. I wanted to support Ursunga. I helped grow some of those plants, and I love their mission. So I definitely got almost all of the meadow plants from them, and a bunch of the smaller trees and shrubs too. But we did not. You probably noticed in there's no deer protection. And we know that there's deer on site, but there hasn't been evidence of deer damage yet. Even like in the remnant forest, there's quite a bit of little seedlings and oaks and hickories and stuff in there. So we're watching really closely. But one of the kind of points of advice that we received was plant larger stock. So I think our red buds were probably the largest trees in there. You can actually kind of, I don't know if you can see them in the photo, but they were, I think they're about this tall or this tall. Yeah. They're not huge. No, I mean, all of the plants in here are pretty, like a gallon or 2 gallon. I think a couple of our plants were maybe 3 or 5 gallon. Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yes. Plugs are great. We did as many plugs as we could. And then when we ran out of those, we did pots and it got very expensive. Yes, exactly. Okay.
The hardest part of the entire thing, and something glossed over, and that's actually working with the organization that's the host.
Yeah.
Whether that's university in this
Mhm.
case, church, government.
Yeah.
Business. You said, you just kept saying like Mason said this or Mason agreed to that.
Mhm.
But there's never like a one person, there's multiple.
That's right.
The cross coordination and communication that has to happen.
Yes.
How did you work through some of those challenges and what are some of the things that you learned?
Yeah, I would say, okay, so the question was, how did we work through kind of some of the institutional permissions and challenges? So definitely our team was a huge part of that, right? And I mentioned that in the key takeaways. So having Donnie on our team, again, she is within university sustainability. Her boss as well, Greg, he was really involved in this project, and he had done, and Greg is here, he's a moderator. So he's a moderator on another session. So he's really interested in native plants. He understands the value, he's bought into this. And so he was kind of helping us work through some of the challenges that we were facing too, like if we weren't getting an approval or if we weren't kind of getting a response from somebody. My advisor, Dr. Dan, coming from the faculty side of things, I think, facilities, from what I understand, is not used to kind of talking to faculty, right? And they're excited when faculty come in and are like, we want to be involved with you on a project. And because ultimately facilities is working to, facilitate a space that is for learning. And that's their mission and goal. So, ultimately, I think facilities was pretty open to this. And yeah, and I also think, we were also lucky. I think this project was at the right time and there was the right space available, and all of that was happening together with the right people. So I think bringing on the right people early on to the project, to the design and, earliest stages, right? Who understand those institutional processes and structures is key. Yeah.
It always takes a team. So
Oh, yeah.
Sarah, thank you